How do you run a business for long-term value generation? Apply the principles of Austrian economics. It's the science of success.
This is the Economics for Business podcast. We are here to help all businesses become champions for customers and value, improving lives with preferred and innovative products and services. We offer you the knowledge and tools to make your entrepreneurial journey a successful one. Now, here's your host, Hunter Hastings.
Hi, Hunter Hastings here. Our metric for business success is value generation. Small, medium, or large, mature or gazelle-like, startup or growth mode or unicorn, none of that is relevant in a value generation system. So how do you run a business for value generation? By running, we don't mean execution. Executional excellence is vitally important, of course, to day-to-day and month-to-month performance. We've covered that in previous episodes, including number 29 specifically. No, today we're discussing long-term value generation. Crucially, that's value for customers, which is subjective and determined solely by them. It's also hard to measure since it includes both quantitative and qualitative components. It's also value for your employees, who seek purpose and meaning in their work, and trust and confidence in their firm. It's value for your suppliers and partners, who seek the security and productivity and trust in your value generation network. And it means value for the business owners, both in profit and non-monetary benefits of fulfillment and achievement and success. For the pathway to long-term value, the foundational and lasting guidance comes from rock-solid, lasting principles consistently applied over time. We take ours from Austrian economics, a source of unwavering economic principles that guides both business and individuals. And we're delighted to have the chance to analyze a long-term case study of Austrian principles in action. To take us through it, we have Professor Per Bylund. As many of you know by now, Per is Professor of Entrepreneurship and Free Enterprise in the Spears School of Business at Oklahoma State University, an Associate Fellow of the Ratio Institute in Stockholm, and he recently edited a special edition of the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics focused on entrepreneurship. It's a great source of insights for business. He's an expert on business firms, having written The Problem of Production, a new theory of the firm, and he writes a monthly column for Entrepreneur magazine. We're very glad to have him here today. Per, welcome again to the Economics for Business podcast.
Thanks for having me, Hunter.
You're a leading innovator for us in translating economic theory into business tools and business practice. And we've talked in the past about a couple of your concepts, the Austrian business paradigm, a way of doing business that's focused on consumer value and end user value. It clarifies business priorities. And then you authored the Austrian business model for us, which is an insight that entrepreneurs need models and not plans. And the models can generate multiple testable value facilitation strategies and tactics. And then you get on a learning pathway to success. And we've talked about demonstrating the approach underpinning the Austrian business paradigm and Austrian business model. One way to do that is a time-based case study. Is there anybody who's applied these principles over time in a way that sets out the foundational theory, translates the theory into principles that we can show have been practiced, and then demonstrates success in use? And you think you found one as an example. So let's start there. Tell us about it.
Well, absolutely. So I try to read as broadly and as deeply too as possible on in this area because it's very interesting to try to apply what we've been talking about, these basic principles, the science of or the logic of action, how we behave and how we should understand the economy and make that useful for entrepreneurs and for business owners and for managers too. And as part of this, I guess it would be two I can't really say that I found it, because I found it in my own bookshelf. 'Cause I probably looked at it before, but I made sure to reread it. The Science of Success, which is a very interesting application of principles and our kind of thinking. What we've been doing in this podcast and in this project, Economics for Business, for a long time, trying to take what we know about the economy and basically the science of Austrian economics and apply it to business to make it useful for business decision makers and in their everyday lives in business. I think this is it's an interesting sort of translation of what we have been saying, and then translation of the theory into more of a practical, almost a guidebook, I guess you could say.
Yeah, and I read the book thanks to your introduction, and I agree with you. It's very pertinent to our project. So let's dive into it. The chapter 1 of the book is an empirical data set or a historical data set, and we'll mention it later, but it sets out the business results of the application of principles. So that's what makes it a case study. Chapter 2 is entitled The Science of Human Action. So obviously that appeals to us and makes it clear that science is defined as the application of principle. So talk about that. Talk about chapter 2 of The Science of Human Action.
Sure. So it's interesting because the chapter begins with a couple of quotes, and one by Ralph Waldo Emerson saying, "The man who grasps principles can successfully select his own methods. The man who tries methods ignoring principles is sure to have trouble." And I think that is absolutely spot on. I mean, a principle is a fundamental truth or proposition on which we base our understanding, and it's sort of a lens through which we can understand the world and look at the world and make sense of it. And then only by making sense of the world and understanding what is going on can we also change it and effect changes to it, which is exactly what entrepreneurs and business owners do in their everyday lives when they try to not only imagine an outcome and try to get there, but do so in a social and economic context in which everybody else is moving around. It's not a kind of game where there are set rules and set players and everything is predictable, but it's very different. Everything is unpredictable in some sense, unless you know the principles. So as we've been talking about in this podcast, if you know the science of human action and know that people are acting purposefully in order to attain some end that they value for whatever reason, we know that they value it, then we can predict and we can attempt to sort of ride on this knowledge and use it to our advantage too. And I think that the chapter does that in a very nice way and looks at the action as purposeful behavior, and from there draws insights into how to understand the economy, and then how to sort of, I hate the term to play the game, but in the sense that entrepreneurs actually do play a game, they do it so much better if they understand what action is, how to strategize action, and how to predict outcomes, and what to actually strive for, which is not necessarily what you learn in school or in other books.
Yes, it's a really nice basis to start with. And then the book specifies that to get from principle to practice, there's a translation mechanism, and they call the translation mechanism dimensions. And there are 5 dimensions. I'd like to go through them one by one because I think they're significant. So the first one, Per, is vision. But he treats vision in a different way than business schools, perhaps. So please talk about vision as expressed in this book.
Right. So when we teach it, we teach it the vision, mission, and strategy, and so forth. Here, the author is really talking about seeking to identify what is the long-term value of the enterprise and of your individual action in a sense too, but specifically, how can you contribute to value overall through your business, and aiming for this long-term effect that you have on the world, rather than looking at the short term. And of course, we talked about this before, that you also need to always maintain a positive cash flow and in order to stay alive. But what matters really in business is that, do you have a role to play? Do you actually contribute to the economy overall, and thereby to consumers' welfare, or satisfying of consumer wants? And that value, that sort of the maximum that you can do, and that you want to do, and aiming for that is your vision. That's what you should always strive for.
Yeah, I really like the expression of vision. I usually dislike the word in business usage. It sounds very transcendental, but his long-term value was based on subjective value, which obviously is what we subscribe to. He talks about value for society, which is subjective value of people who are customers and consumers. Subjective value is based on people valuing a good. And it's value in the sense that we would use it as Austrian economists, I think, as opposed to shareholder value or any of those other kinds of values that you read about in the business press.
Right. It's much more, I wouldn't say maybe ambiguous, but it's harder to measure. It's not just maximizing dollars in, or dollars on your bottom line, but instead it is to actually make an impact, make a change in people's lives. And of course, we talked about this before, that the more value that you create in the eyes of consumers or your customers, the more value you are able to capture through the price, which is, of course, there's no misalignment in the incentives here. The more value that you contribute, the more value you can get yourself. And that is, of course, a beautiful thing. But then in order to do that, you need to recognize that the value you contribute to others is not really on your terms. It's value in their terms, and hence the subjective value.
Yeah, and before we leave value, I also appreciated that the book talks about long-term value specifically. And there's been a lot of criticism in the business press about the short-termism of quarterly results and so on. And long-term value has an economic component. It's the way economists urge us to think, but also a moral component. Henry Hazlitt, in his Foundations of Morality, says that looking at the long term is basically the underpinnings of morality. So it puts businesses on the right moral track as well as the right economic track.
Right. I mean, short term, you can make a quick buck in many different ways, but primarily probably not by not contributing value, lasting value for others. But if you want a lasting company, you need to contribute lasting value. So it's in a sense, it's very obvious to focus on having this long-term effect and producing value for others long-term. But it might be hard to focus on that when you're struggling with everyday tasks and getting everything to work and getting ends meet every day or every week. But I mean, unless you have this vision of where you want to be and what you want to do for others, you can't really align the present with the future either, which means that you will get lost, you will wander a bit, and then you might end up anywhere. You will definitely not create as much value and as much effect on society as you want to or as possible.
The second medium that the book lists, not necessarily in order, obviously, but the second of the five, was virtue and talents. And I love to see the word virtue in a business text.
Yeah, we don't really think about virtue and business very often, or maybe we do it in certain terms of vices rather, which would sort of be a something we've, I think, inherited from the times of old, and Karl Marx and others who sort of think that of property or profit, that you earn profit on someone else's at someone else's expense, which is of course not what we're doing here. So, I mean, to be virtuous here and have virtue is to want to contribute that value and realize that by helping others, you're helping yourself. So in here for this principle, the virtue and talents, I mean, then you're hiring people who have the right values, who fit in your organization, who fit with the long-term goal, the vision that you have in your business, who are interested in and hopefully passionate about implementing and reaching that goal. You want people who, of course, have the skills to help the business get there, and whatever capabilities and knowledge that is necessary. But I think in general, you should hire for attitude and train for skill, as my wife keeps telling me that businesses should do, which simply means that you hire the right people who are sort of mentally or ethically or internally equipped to play an important role in the organization and for the end goal, to implement and to reach the vision that you have for the business. So it's about finding those people who are already aligned with where you want to go and who can contribute to this journey to get there.
A quick note. Did you know that we provide supplemental materials for each podcast? Listening to and understanding the key takeaways from our expert guests helps you think better about building a more beautiful business. Taking direct action and implementing these strategies is when the real work begins. Take a concrete, immediate step to implementing a better business model today by downloading the show notes and business tool we've created for this episode. Visit Mises.org/E4Bpod. That's MISES.org/E4BPOD and click on today's episode. Now, back to our interview.
And it makes hiring a very fundamental core component of your business, to find those people, as you mentioned, and perhaps train them and monitor them to make sure that fit between their values and the vision is staying in the ratio that you want it to. So hiring becomes very fundamental.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's something that we don't always think about enough. But hiring the wrong person, I mean, hiring is really expensive for any business. And hiring the wrong person can be disastrous for the organization and for the business. And it can really lead to bankruptcy, because you can create conflicts internally. You can it can cause these political conflicts within the organization, rather than having an alignment where everybody is working together towards the same goal. So you can create conflicts, and those conflicts need to be handled and managed. And that's a lot of effort and time and expense too that goes into this. So finding the right person, the right type of person, and I think that's what's so important, that the author is focusing on hiring someone based on their values, rather than whatever specific skill they might have. Because if their values their values are so fundamental to who they are as a human being, and what they want to learn, and what they probably can learn too, and where they want to go, that hiring someone with the right values as opposed to the wrong values or just different values is in a sense a recipe for success for the organization, because that person is not going to go wrong. It's not going to cause a lot of problems.
And then the third medium, which was particularly interesting, was knowledge processes, complementing those people and supporting the vision with knowledge processes, creating, acquiring, sharing, and applying relevant knowledge. And that's pretty consistent, I think, isn't it, Per, with our theories of entrepreneurship, that it's a knowledge-based activity.
Yeah, absolutely. And finding out what you don't know, but that you need to know, is, of course, core to anything you do, but especially when you're bearing the uncertainty, as entrepreneurs always do, trying to do something novel, something new that hasn't been done before. Then getting the knowledge, but getting the right type of knowledge and acquiring it in a low cost but high quality way, and so forth, is, of course, super important.
Yeah, and I just note that what we're trying to do with Economics for Business and the processual platform that we're building is to make it a entrepreneurial knowledge management system that they can have their own knowledge processes, just as this author suggests. The fourth medium I thought about deeply, and I'm not sure where to come out. Let's see what you say, is decision rights. Now, I've been in decision rights meetings in corporate consulting that became downright wars because they're turf battles. But the author calls it the right people in the right roles with the right authority to take decisions. And I guess it doesn't force an organizational design, whether it's network or hierarchy or some other design. And it doesn't talk about leadership, which is a controversial word, I think. It talks about the process and structure of decision making. What was your reaction to that one?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it has to do with sort of the scope that any person is trusted to make decisions in. So how much of an impact your decisions can have, and in a sense, the size of the budget that you control in the decision, the dollar amount that you can dedicate to a project and whatever decisions that you're making. And this is about empowering people to make these decisions. And some people are not only good at, but also willing to make decisions and do it well. And they should, of course, be rewarded with whenever they make decisions that are good for the business and pan out and they learn and become better and better, they should probably be empowered to make bigger and bigger decisions as well, as long as they, of course, stick to the vision and things like that. But if you have hired based off of their values and they are already in line with the business, then this should be a smaller problem. I mean, you mentioned turf wars, and I think that is very common. And in a business where you have hired people with different values, people wanting to do different things, everybody might not be in complete agreement with the vision that the business has, except for, of course, if you ask them explicitly, they will all agree. But they might have different interpretations of what that means. They might want to get there in different ways, and all of these things that really are based on who you are as a person, and the type of values that you have that are core to your being. But if you've hired the right people, then you should, of course, try them out and ask them to make decisions and be empowered to make decisions. And the better they are at it, the more they try, in a sense, and the more they accomplish, you, in a sense, you give them more leeway. You give them more space to make more and bigger decisions. And in the sense that it's also a trial and error sort of thing, where you figure out how far they can be trusted. That doesn't sound very good, but how far their capability to make these decisions can be trusted. So some people can probably turn into really good decision makers on really big issues that have a huge impact on the business, whereas others, they're not comfortable, or it goes beyond their abilities or what have you. But by looking at these decision rights and giving people the right to make decisions and allowing them to make bigger and bigger, more impactful decisions as they see fit themselves, it's about empowering each employee. And I think that is very important, that you have them both aligned with the vision and the values, and then also let them grow as big and impactful as they can, because that's obviously in to the business's benefit.
Yeah, another way to say that is that decision rights can be earned as opposed to imposed by the organizational design. And earning could include both the learning that you're talking about, you get better and better at it over time, but also having the support of those for whom the decisions are made. And that's when decision rights stop being a turf war, and everybody can look at that decision maker and say they've earned that right because they've proven the track record for decision making in the past. So insofar as that applies, I think that's very positive.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think very often in existing businesses, you hire a new manager or something, but is that manager's decisions impactful? Well, manager might not actually have values that are in line with the vision of the business, or might have completely different ideas of what are we to do now, and things like that. And it might mean that, well, people don't actually do what the new manager tells them to do, or follow the direction, simply because that person has not earned that stature, that level in this organization. So in this sense, they're sort of growing managers bottom up instead of hiring from external sources, and getting people from completely different backgrounds and just placing them in spots high up in the hierarchy, so to speak, and make decisions. I mean, if you earn this impact, this authority, I guess, then it's much easier to respect the decision makers too. And I think that is a very important lesson, something to consider in all businesses.
Right, absolutely. Good. And then the fifth of these 5 mediums was incentives, which is right in the center of the target for economists, obviously. But the book tries to loop it back to vision, which was about identifying long-term value. And they refer to incentives as rewarding people according to the value they create. So that's a nice circle. But as you said, subjective value is really hard to measure. So how can the incentives work? How did you take away from the idea of incentives in this context?
Well, I think this is sort of the final piece of the puzzle to align people's actions with the visions. So you pick the people based off of their values, and that their values are already in line with the vision for the business, and then you pay them in accordance with how they contribute to achieving this end. So I think it has to do with not necessarily only profitability on sort of the corporate level, but also how well the decisions have been made, and how well the decisions pan out compared to what is expected, of course. So if you do better than was expected, you should probably get a raise. If you do worse than expected, and then maybe your decision rights should be rolled back a little bit, because maybe it's beyond your ability or beyond your interest, perhaps even. But other than that, I mean, this is sort of a marketization of the internal structure of a business, where you in a sense put a market price, but internally, on people's effort and people's not what they put in, but what they get out, right? So it's the same as a business. A business is not successful because it spends a lot of money on stuff. It's not government. But a business is successful because it creates so much more value than the cost they assume in order to get there. And this is sort of applying this onto each employee too, that if they create more value, then they take out of the business in forms of salary and other costs, then obviously their value to the business net is higher, and therefore they should be rewarded more too, and they should get a salary increase or more benefits or what have you. But it should correspond to and be sort of proportional to the value that you contribute.
Well, just to wrap up those 5 mediums, as the author calls them, they've all got to do with value and subjective value. So that's really encouraging. The vision is about long-term value. Virtue and talents is about people with the right values to create consumer value. The knowledge processes are about how to achieve that value. The decision rights support value creation, and the incentives are wrapped up in the value they create. So that seems to be a very nice set focused on what we believe in, which is generating value.
Yeah, this is very much in line with what we have been talking about all along. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily choose the exact same terms or explain it in the exact same way, but it's very much in line with what we've been talking about, and also how the profitability of a business and the impact of a business has to do with your contribution to society, in a sense, but society in terms of each individual consumer's want satisfaction from your actions.
The next part of the book goes through those mediums and their application. And it does so by focusing on concepts that are specifically economic concepts. And we may not have time to go through all of them, but I'd like to touch on them as they're mentioned in the order that they mentioned. Subjective value obviously is central, and we've talked about that a lot. I would just note here, and we'll have you back to discuss it at a future time, Per. You and Dr. Packard wrote a paper called Subjective Value in Entrepreneurship, and it creates a whole system around subjective value. And it sounds like this author is trying to do the same thing.
Yeah, and I think this is the correct starting point for any discussion on the economy, of course, as we've been talking about many times already, that unless you recognize that value is the satisfaction experienced by people on whatever terms, their own terms, you're not going to be able to satisfy them. You're not going to be able to charge a high price. You're not going to be able to cover your costs to the extent that is otherwise possible. So you're simply not doing the best you can. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of people are thinking value in objective terms, which leads you wrong, because it's easily disproven that if value is truly objective, then in any transaction, then you either have one winner and one loser, or you're both, you don't really care because it's the same value. Well, obviously, no one would want to go through with such a transaction, and no one would want to exchange in order to lose. So there's something wrong here. Everybody who is in the marketplace knows that, well, you go through with an exchange because you think that you're better off afterwards. And if the other person is not coerced to do it, then that person has exactly the same feeling about it, that they will be better off going through with the transaction than not. So obviously, you can't value the things in the same way, or this wouldn't happen. So it is core to understand what actually is going on.
The second economic concept the book refers to is creative destruction, and they specifically invoke Schumpeter in that, although we might be more comfortable with the idea of dynamic efficiency, as De Soto calls it, or the market as a process, as Lackman calls it. But the translation is consistent. Companies must continuously drive constructive change within themselves, or alternatively, others will, and the company will fail competitively. So we embrace that, I believe, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as soon as you stop being entrepreneurial internally and stop sort of challenging what you do and considering counterfactuals and other things to do, other ways to do them, and try to figure out better and more valuable, I should say, ways, you're sort of already dying. And you have entered you're not in the entrepreneurial value creative realm anymore, but you're rather in sort of the maintenance mode, where you are a bureaucrat rather than a leader and a creator. So you're not making much of a difference in people's lives anymore. So you definitely have to consistently try to renew yourself. And that's why I also usually say also, which is very provocative, that in a free market, monopolies are not really a problem, because a monopoly would be one seller of something that it has renewed themselves and become so good at doing whatever they're doing that no one else can or even want to try competing with them. That's not a problem for consumers. That's actually good for consumers, and then we don't need others to compete with them either. It's enough that others might compete with them as soon as they sort of slack off and they stop renewing themselves. But that's a discussion for another episode, I guess.
Yep. Yeah, although I like the Peter Thiel idea that every entrepreneur should aim for a monopoly. That's the job. And
that's efficient too, right? I mean, if every business, again, we should probably dig into this in another episode, but if every business is unbeatable at what they're doing because they're so good at it, well, then you don't need the redundancy of competitors and so forth. Mm-hmm. And if they continue to renew themselves, then consumers are just basically just eating the value that is being created and thrown at them. And there's no problem in that at all.
Another economic concept that you and I have talked about. We did a podcast about it, opportunity cost. But the interesting element here is that this concept, always looking at the value, the most valuable alternative that you've got to forego to undertake a certain act, the author looked at it through accounting. He compared opportunity cost with book cost and sunk cost. And in the company, they actually found a way to identify the profit lost as a consequence of an opportunity not taken. So that's the translation of opportunity cost into bookkeeping, which I thought was pretty new.
Yeah, it is, and it's innovative, and it's very interesting. I mean, just theoretically for an academic like myself, but it should be something that most businesses would want to try to mimic or do themselves. I mean, try to imagine the power if you could make decisions based off of knowing, or at least having good predictions of the profitability of different alternatives, and you consistently look at those numbers. What will this lead to, rather than what you have and what you put into it, and things like that. And that means you can consistently make decisions for whatever is most profitable, that gives you the greatest return, and whether or not that changes the direction of the business. As long as you stay true to your vision, of course, but this might also feed into changing the vision if the marketplace has changed.
And then the next concept, just to touch on briefly, talks about comparative advantage, which I think we've also discussed, not competitive, but comparative. And really spending time figuring out, both for you as an individual and for the firm, what your comparative advantage is, which is maybe that route to a monopoly that you were talking about in positive terms.
Yeah, exactly. So what are we good at as a business? Well, that's probably something we should pursue doing more of. And what are people good at individually? That's probably how we should use quote unquote. And that's how we're hiring them too, right? That we're figuring out their values, and then we're figuring out how they can contribute the most possible value to the overall business and where we're trying to go.
The next term that I picked up was principled entrepreneurship, which it's hard to disagree with, obviously, but the author focused it on creating long-term real value for society via economic means. And that's consistent with John Mackey, for example, and his conscious capitalism, and kind of raising the positive profile of capitalism. I like the idea of principled entrepreneurship.
Yeah, I like it too. It's a good term, and I think it is used in a good way too, to make sure that you have this positive impact on society and the world, and of course consumers, which, well, we're all consumers, so consumers are in a sense society, but always focusing on being this value generative, value facilitating power in society, and do so in a respectful, honorable way.
One more economic concept, and then we'll move on. They talked about marginal analysis in kind of a different way, the analysis of the costs and benefits of a change. So specifically focusing on change and trying to analyze the pluses and minuses of that. I thought that was a quite distinctive way of thinking about marginal analysis.
Yeah, and it's a way that makes sense for the business. I mean, if you are we going into this line of business? Are we buying this other business? Are we changing production? How is that going to affect the return overall? Well, that is the marginal, that change that we are affecting in the business, that is going to have some impact. Is that going to increase our return, or is it going to decrease our return? And then, of course, together with opportunity cost, what are our options, and which option is the best one? Unless you're looking at, if you're not looking at these changes themselves as the unit, then it's very difficult to figure out how to go about changes in the right way. And of course, a change can be something really small, and it can also be something monstrously big. But the question is not how much money do you put into a project, but rather what is the return from it. So if it's big or small, it shouldn't really matter all that much. as long as you can do it, right? But if the return on a small project is much higher than on the big project, go for the smaller one, and vice versa.
So all of this pair comes together cogently in what the author calls a management system. They put a brand name on it, market-based management. You could put other brand names on it, but it's the application of the science of human action at the firm level. And I just wanted to get your point of view about such a codified system of management. It seems to me distinctive from the things you typically read about in organizational design or processes or strategies. This is an all-encompassing system. It's applied in a conglomerate, so it's so that the center can let the units proceed as they wish based on this codified system. What's your point of view about the value of that?
Yeah, I think it has a huge value because it's sort of a framework for how to do business and what we believe in the business. That it's not just these empty one-liners and slogans, but instead explains why and says that these are our principles and these principles mean this, and this implies this type of structure and this type of activity. And this is something, I wonder if not the author is actually, or the business is actually giving this book to all new employees to read so that they know that they are in line with what the business is thinking. So everybody's aware of the system that they're using, and they thereby get a language for how to think about these things. That have they done their jobs correctly in HR and hired people with the right values? They should already be aligned, but they might not have the terminology. And then see that, but these values that I share actually lead to this type of organization. That's what this organization is. So in a sense, I think this should not only empower new hires, but also make them excited about the business. And it's when you're deriving a system like this from principles, the way it is done in this book and the way that we've been discussing it too, what you get is it's a very simple to understand structure that has enormous implications, but that is a sort of a structure that you can apply in your everyday work, both short term and long term, because the principles always hold and the principles are always applicable, and you stand by those principles, and then those can be sort of a lighthouse to guide you in any decision you might have to make in everyday lives, whether big or small.
So, Per, can we translate this down to smaller entrepreneurial businesses? This case study, as we're calling it, pays off by pointing to a 50-year track record of 16 times better return to investors than the average S&P 500 company, which is a great endorsement of this system. I would believe that we can translate this down to smaller businesses that instead of giving business units this freedom that you talked about, you're doing it for employees or for smaller teams. You're letting them maximize their own individual contribution within the framework, as you called it. You let the subunits, the individuals, find out what works and what doesn't within that framework. I think it's translatable. Do you agree?
Absolutely. And I think that is the beauty of having a system like this based off of basic principles, that the principles scale up without any problem. And as long as you're aware of and you subscribe to those principles, it doesn't really matter if you apply the implications and whatever truths you derive from the principles on individuals or business units, or maybe even corporate entities or businesses within your big concern. It doesn't matter because these scale up very beautifully. And of course, if you stick to them and you actually implement them, and then there will also be an alignment between these components, whether they are individuals or units or separate businesses. So I think that it's a great way of thinking that is sort of lost in business schools today when we teach sort of faceless methods, and we give them a toolkit of different measures or methods that you just can throw in whenever they have a specific problems or a way of thinking about strategy, but there are no principles involved. There are no basic values involved either, but it's just about tweaks in order to solve problems and make sure to get out of the hole, whatever hole you're in, quickly, dirtily if necessary. Whereas this type of approach would instead create a business that is already perfectly aligned in terms of values and principles and actions too, and that is pushing in the same direction all of the components at once. So you should probably have much fewer of these problems to try to tweak and solve along the way, because you simply don't you create a business around this type of framework that doesn't really allow for these problems to happen, unless of course you deviate from the structure.
Yep. Well, it's a nice way to conclude, I think. And you talked about the business school strategies a little bit faceless. I think one of the words we can put on this construct that we've been discussing today is perhaps more humanistic, in the Mengerian sense that economics is about humans. The author talks about the science of human action, and that's what we're going to try to do with our economics for business entrepreneurial journey that we're assembling right now. So leave us with your conclusion about whether Austrian economics is the most appropriate, or certainly a appropriate underlying philosophy for a system like this. It might be a bit distinctive versus the one we've actually discussed, but in principle, we're going to build a business system around it.
Yeah, and I think it is definitely the correct way of doing it. I mean, not only does it have the structure of what we've been talking about today, in having these basic principles, or even in the case of Austrian economics, having this one axiom, this one understanding for what action is, from which we then derive all these other statements that must be true about how the economy works, and that gives us an understanding for what is going on, which I think is very important too, to realize that Austrian economics provides us with an understanding and not necessarily the tools to predict. So in a sense, it is a framework for entrepreneurs to gain this understanding, to maybe learn a terminology too, but at least put words on things that they observe and that they sort of tacitly understand, and expand their understanding and how these parts or pieces fit together. And then from there, use their best judgment in order to position their business and position their value proposition and their contribution within this sea of economic activity that is already going on. It's very different from other schools of thought in especially economics, and this formalism where the point is to dress everything in numbers and then try to predict things and sort of be an engineer of the economy, whereas we realize in Austrian economics that no, it's an entrepreneurially driven process that is ever changing, where you will need to make all these adjustments. But the point is that as long as you recognize the value that you can contribute to people and on what terms, that is their terms, you have this guiding star that you can follow. You have the direction already. And it's so much easier to run a business based off of that recognition. And I think the author of this book here does this pretty well, starting with these principles, which are definitely compatible with Austrian economics, and then builds a framework for this business, and has in fact organized the business around it as well. And this is something, maybe not necessarily this book, but the principles that we've been talking about, something to do in your startup or in your small or medium-sized business, and try to figure out what are the principles that you stand for and stand by, and what are the principles that you share in the business, and in a sense, who in your business fits and who does not, and how do you make the next new hire, and what is the actual value that you're aiming for. There are so many questions that have rather simple answers, rather easily understandable answers if you just apply the right method or the right way of thinking about it. And that's Austrian economics.
Good. Well, thank you, Per. With your help, we're going to continue building that knowledge management system that helps people follow the guiding star, as you so mellifluously put it, and we'll continue to take your assistance and support in getting there, which we hope to do soon. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Hunter.
Economics for Business is a production of the Mises Institute. To explore more content like this, visit Mises.org. And for more from Hunter Hastings, visit hunterhastings.com.